And so I stopped in the first sequence talking about Egypt and how we know about the myth of Egypt. Let's hop over to Sumeria. There were a lot of poems being written about myth in Sumeria, and the Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations were concurrent. They were going on at the same time. They wrote down their creation myths. They wrote down other poems. For example, the Descent of Inanna that we're going to take a look at, and then the Enuma Elish, which might be Babylonian as opposed to Sumerian, but the Sumerian and Babylonian myth are pretty much the same, and I talk about that later in Module 3, Creation Myths. So we know about these mythoi from various sources. When we were able to crack the Mayan code, we learned something about their myth, and so various ways of learning. Are these myths literature because they're written down? I don't think so. And all the definitions that we have looked at, I would define myth as literature, not because the style of the writing, even though some of these myths did introduce forms that were used later. For example, Hesiod, which is not a function of the myth per se, but Hesiod, when he writes the Theogony, says that he fell asleep and the gods came to him in a dream and told him how they had been born in other in myths and the lineage and the genealogy. The dream motif exists throughout history, and we still use it today. But it's not the style in which they were written. It is not the intent with which they were written. And there is a lesson on Joseph Campbell in the functions of myth. And myth does serve 4 basic functions. And also in Byerlin, he talks about the functions of myth as well. Some of them are didactic. Some of them are scientific, early science, intended to show how the universe works. So it's not the intent of these myths that make them literature. And so you're saying, get to it, Gwen. What is the point? Why do you think makes them literature? I think they're literature because of their universality, which is the topic of this class, comparative myth. We are still reading and still have a huge interest in myths that were written down before they were passed down, after they were passed down orally, that are 4,000, 4,500 years old. Why? And as a teacher and student of myth for a long time, when I tell people I teach mythology, no one ever says to me, oh, well, that really sounds boring. The response is, I bet that's really interesting. I wish I could take your class. So there is an interest in myth, and it continues on, and it is because of the universality. In one of the lessons, I talk about the different kinds of myth, not the functions of myth, but the different kinds of myth. One of the kinds of myth is human themes. Humans have not changed since we became human. Our circumstances have changed. You are looking at a screen now, and you are hearing me speak, and you are seeing me. Outside of Tolkien's Palantirs and scrying bowls and those types of things, this wasn't possible. And of course, it wasn't possible through those things either. But people wrote about them for a long time before they were actually invented. But the universality, the circumstance changes, humans haven't changed. We still love, we still hate, we still have greed, we are still kind. All of those things that make us human compel us to act in certain ways. So when Demeter goes in search of Persephone and will not give up until she finds her daughter, you see this in a parallel of not even fiction in modern America, but a real life scenario. And I'm referring to When the young girl Elizabeth Smart was abducted in Utah, her parents continued looking for her, and she was found. How many of us as parents, or even as children, or even for friends, would keep up that search? Most of us would. Many of us would. That is something that hasn't changed. Love hasn't changed. Jealousy hasn't changed. And we read these myths because they resonate to our humanity. And I think that this is very clearly shown. So in comparative myth, we are going to look at myth and look at these commonalities and these parallels between these myths over periods of time, in various cultures, in various locations. Myths are a form of literature. Nobody would deny that. But it's not because they were written down. It is because they have more than withstood the test of time. When people are no longer reading Shakespeare, when they're no longer reading Stephen King, and even when the paper that these myths are written on crumble into dust, the themes of the myths will continue. And not only that, Shakespeare and Stephen King take the themes from those myths and write about them in their works and in their genres. There's nothing new. And we will see this reflected in old myth and new myth, because we'll talk about modern myths in this class as well. I do want to add one more thing before I stop pontificating and get off my soapbox, and that is about the evolution of myth and how it has contributed to literature in other ways. Poetry was the first form of literature. Writing was invented not to write literature, but to record taxes and for very practical purposes. But over a period of time, of course, cultures did record not only their myths, but other tales as well. But they were poems, and they were poems for a very good reason. It was because they were oral traditions. And poetry is much easier to remember and to recite than is prose. And all I have to do to exemplify that is to ask you, how many songs do you know? Set it to music is even more. How many songs do you know by heart? And how many do you know just bits and pieces of? Dozens? Hundreds? Poetry, you might know fewer poems that have not been set to music, but all songs are poems set to music. And so the oral traditions was poetry, and very often set to music. They were songs. So when you read the Descent of Inanna, and it is repetitive, and it says the same line over and over again with slight variations throughout the poem, easy to remember. Now, that is one way that mythology contributed to literature, because those early poems, they had to deal with mythic themes. Another way is that drama, which is the second oldest form of literature, grew out of mythology. Why, Gwen, you say, how did that happen? Early drama consisted of ritual. The priest and maybe the priestess and maybe some members of the congregation would come in and they would perform rituals. And over a period of time, the rituals became extremely stylized and essentially became plays. So you have in Greece, and then later in Rome and in other cultures as well, you have a god specifically for drama. And in Greece it was Dionysus. And so plays grew out of rituals that took place in religious ceremonies. Later, down the line, in the Middle Ages, you have the cycle plays or the mystery plays. Now, mystery does not mean mystery, but is probably a, I don't want to say corruption of the word master, but that is what it is from. And the cycle plays, the mystery plays, were performed in order to educate an illiterate society about biblical tales. They were serving the same purpose that the rituals that the pagans were doing back in Greece and in other places, serving the same purpose, educating a populace that didn't know how to read about religion and about the myths of that religion. So both poetry and drama originally based in myth. And of course, from my very biased point of view, everything is based on myth. I am passionate about mythology, and mythology permeates every level and every aspect of our society and other societies. So, literature. People will continue to define literature as they see fit. And some people will say literature is elevated, it's high class, it's Dickens, it is Shakespeare. And then other people will take a broader view and say, no, everything I read is literature. In this class, we are going to be examining mythology. And mythology is most definitely a form or genre of literature. Whew! I bet you got an earful, didn't you? I'm going to stop there.